Welcome to Africa International Advisors' very own podcast series called Navigating Complexity. My name is Hasnain Ibrahim, and I will be your host for today. Navigating complexity really has to deal with the issues that ultimately face leaders on a daily basis. How do we make good decisions in a really complex, complicated world? That, I think, is probably the hardest job and perhaps the most important job that leaders ultimately face. The world we live in is an exceedingly complex one. Making decisions in this world requires a really comprehensive and perhaps integrated way at looking at it. So the first conversation that we are going to have as part of the Navigating Complexity series deals with people. As leaders, probably the most important decision that we make around people deals with recruitment of individuals. Recruitment of the people that ultimately make up your organization. I'm joined today by a senior business leader, Zach Perry, who leads NIQ Nielsen IQ Southern Africa, as well as GFK Southern Africa. Zach, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Hasnain.
Perhaps if we can begin with a quick introduction to who you are, some experience, relevant experience that you have, and your interest in this particular topic on recruitment.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting topic to me personally, and that I think comes through for various reasons. One of them, I think I was always interested in trying to understand what makes people tick. So that led me down a path of various subjects in university, like psychology. I didn't feel like I got to the heart of what was driving human behavior within that particular field. It provides like a good context for it, but then I went on to study things like human evolution and behavior and things like that to try and get to the essence of why we do what we do. And then subsequent to that, obviously, I've been working in a lot of research businesses, and most recently in the role that you're talking about as managing director, obviously, on a very regular basis, we have to go through a process of trying to identify who's the best for this particular role. And I think I used to think of myself as maybe a bit of an expert in trying to figure out other people. And based on my track record with the people I've hired, I can put my hand up and say I've made a lot of mistakes in the past. So that led me down a path, quite a deep path of trying to figure out what were the problems in that whole process of selection, and what kind of tools and frameworks we can utilize to improve those decisions.
So you touched on a few key points, but perhaps if we can begin with the mistakes that you've made, and what were some of the challenges that you experienced that led to the wrong decisions ultimately being taken?
So I've analyzed those particular decisions, and I think I've observed that I pick up on a certain set of information and interpret it in a particular way. And it's fascinating, like when I've then, subsequent to this, I now always include other people in the whole interview process to try and get an alternative perspective. And it's really fascinating where I've picked up on something, I've interpreted it in a certain way, and I cross-reference that against somebody else, and they've interpreted it in a completely different way. So I've learned my own sort of fallibilities in this whole process, and I think it's made me realize that I am really drawn to charming people. And that isn't necessarily somebody who's going to be perfect for that role. I really like charming people. If somebody can make me laugh, I automatically, I think, create this halo of this person is smart, they're capable, etc. And I think I'm a little bit susceptible to charming wasters, I'm afraid. So I've learned to check my own perception against the perception of other people.
So I think the point that you're drawing to here ultimately is the fact that we are in our decision-making processes influenced by our own personal biases. And these biases drive us towards decisions that ultimately sometimes are good and oftentimes may not necessarily yield the results that we are ultimately looking towards. One of the solutions you propose to overcoming that bias is to have different perspectives in the room so that we can balance it out. Because not everybody has the same sort of biases, and so by having those various perspectives, we can oftentimes limit the risk associated with it. What are some of the other potential mechanisms that are available to us to obtain a more holistic picture, potentially, that can possibly overcome some of these biases?
Sure, yeah. Bias is a big issue, right? And that sort of reached popular understanding. I think everybody understands that bias is a risk in business, and that's reflected in the fact that we've got, bias-busting training. I'm not too sure how effective it is, but everyone sort of understands that bias is a bit of a problem. And maybe before I answer your question, also just to pause on this topic of bias, because it's really interesting. Fundamentally, what's going on with bias is you're replacing a difficult, relevant question. In this case, it's like, who's the best person for the job? That's a difficult question to answer. And when your psychology is confronted with difficult questions, what you do is you replace it with a simpler and in some sense more satisfying question. Like, who do I like? In my case, I'm just figuring out who do I like. And that swap of a difficult, relevant question for an easier but less relevant question is the fundamental operation of bias. And, the list of biases is just growing year on year. They do a lot of these experiments and find, I think there's several hundred now that have been identified. But what connects them all at heart is this operation of separating this relevant, difficult question with an easy but irrelevant question. And that's what degrades the quality of those decisions under bias. It's the irrelevance of the question you're actually trying to answer. So there are, I think, a lot of models and frameworks that we can look to from the field of, in particular, cognitive science. So cognitive science very much has brought this idea of bias to public awareness. Everybody's aware of it. But they've also been looking at what might improve the quality of decisions, because ultimately bias leads us to decisions that are a little bit compromised. The quality of those decisions are therefore a little bit compromised as well. So there are actually quite a lot of protocols and frameworks that come from that field. I think actually one of them is perhaps suggested by some of the work of a chap by the name of Philip Tetlock. He was, because you'd say, look, okay, people are biased, therefore I'm going to trust an expert. I'm going to trust somebody who's really trained in how to think logically and reach a good decision. Really troublingly, this guy, Philip Tetlock, he studied people who forecast for a living. So like political commentators, economists, these sorts of things. And he studied them over many years, I think up until about 2003. And by the end of his experiment, he'd collected about, I think it's 80,000 forecasts from these experts. And these are people who are deriving their salary from making predictions. And he gave them 3 options in all of these judgment cases. So you've got a third probability to get it right if you're just randomly selecting the outcome. And he found that people who are paid to forecast are no better than dart-throwing monkeys. So you can't trust experts either. But what he did find suggests what we can do to improve the quality of our decisions, which is he found that about 2% of people he studied were, in his words, super forecasters. So they were, in fact, able to forecast quite accurately. And what separated those people from the general population was a method. They used a very specific method to improve the quality of their decisions, which kind of hopefully answers your question a little bit. And the fundamental operation of that method was to take this really difficult question, who's the best person for the job, which is impossible to answer straight away, and they break it down into littler questions. And they answer the littler questions and then synthesize. And that's very much the work of strategy consultancy, right? Complex questions. So you guys get it. So I think the fundamental operation that we can apply to selections is the same as the operation you'd apply to strategic questions.
So I really like the thinking in relation to how it's being unpacked, because really that's the philosophy that we utilize and adopt in navigating complex situations, all right? Because how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, one piece at a time, right? So you've got to break things down into its component parts, right? And so when you think about the world around us, we actually have an overload of information. There's perhaps too much information that's available to us. And biases to an extent exist as heuristics almost in order for us to focus on that which perhaps has resonated or has met our expectations in some way or form by virtue of our experience through life. So it's really a means of filtering information, right? But it's not necessarily the best. It's clearly not the best means of filtering information. And there are more structured approaches, methods that allows us to make sense of complicated scenarios to actually drive towards decisions that may be more relevant or correct really in relation to the real answer or real question that we're trying to answer. So building off of that, right? Because we're coming to the fact that yes, there's information that we're getting from a particular candidate, and I think this is a good place to start, right? Because it presents a complicated challenge, because on the one hand, your selection criteria may not simply be about competence, right? So the most competent person for the job may not necessarily be the one that fits in with the culture of the organization, as an example, and you can be destructive in other ways as opposed to necessarily, not just doing your job, right? And so how do you balance, or how does the method that you subscribe to balance or trade off some of the dynamics that may be at play, or some of the attributes that ultimately would be what you would be looking for in candidates that you are ultimately interviewing?
It's a good question. Just thinking about it, look, nobody's got the whole package. Nobody comes with the whole package. That's why we work in teams, that's why we work in companies. We rely on the various different skills that people bring that in collaboration can achieve something so much greater than we could have in isolation. So whilst I myself would try to structure the fundamental things that I'm looking for across various units, I would always expect that there's very few people who are going to come through that whole interview process that really tick every single box. If they are, maybe there's something a little bit awry with how they're presenting themselves. So culture can definitely be one dimension, but I do look at that to a certain extent. I think there is a little bit of discussion around, how do you ensure you get a certain amount of diversity that comes through to the organization? I think my response to that would be, it's probably healthier to have a bit more of a clear and unified corporate culture, because there is, even though you might not have called it out and calling it in a specific way and communicating that out, there is a culture that exists whether you're aware of it or not. And so it's probably healthier to be conscious of it and to try and drive it in a particular direction. And then my response to the critique of, if you're just recruiting for people who share the culture with your organization, isn't that contra diversity? Well, my response to that would be the fundamental thing we want to ensure with diversity is diversity of opinion. Because it's where we all have the same opinion about what we should do in a certain context. That is the recipe for potential disaster. Because if everybody's thinking the same way, it's got the same perspective, opinion, we might not be protecting ourselves from some bigger risks that might be obvious to somebody else, but are not obvious to everybody who's got that same sort of lens. Yeah. So that would be my response to that. But like I said, nobody is the whole package. I think there are various protocols that exist to help us as we go through the process of trying to figure out whether this person is suitable for the role or not. Everybody varies. Everybody comes with a huge amount of variation. If you just think about all of the dimensions that people vary on, it's personality, there's IQ, there's the habits that they work on a daily basis. And those sorts of things are not visible to us, right? We only see our own behavior, we don't see the behavior of other people. And I think, you're in a position, like a senior position, you work across a lot of people. And people who are in those positions, we've got the benefit of seeing just how diverse the behavior is of people. So, when you mix that huge range of the different types of behavior that people come with, the different level of resilience, the different level of goal orientation, we should expect there to be hugely different outcomes in, when that person is slotted into an organization. So I think there's a huge variation in the productivity of people as a function of all of this variation. And I think if you just take a snapshot in time, that variation between those people at any one time is, I think, necessarily always going to be greater than the variation that's possible within an individual's lifetime on average. And to me, that suggests, as a business leader, if we want to maximize the productivity of the workforce, which is, of course, in a service economy, that's exactly what we want to do. The biggest leverage we have over that is not like training programs. They obviously have their place. But the biggest leverage we have is who we select, selections, and then who we retain and who we promote. Because, like I said, the variation between productivity of people is always greater than the variation between an individual's ability to become more productive over time, which they can. But on average, the variation between people is so much greater.
So recruiting right is absolutely critical for success, ultimately, for increased productivity, greater leverage within the organization, and
you see it kind of like, when you start in a management position, if you're, conscientious, you're going to try and figure out, well, what the hell do I do now, right? So there's no manual. Nobody gives you a manual and say, hey, you're a manager, congratulations, here's the manual, great. It's never happened.
Exactly.
So we're then left with like a vacuum, and then we typically go to a bookshop, we go to the library, we try and read, leadership literature, management literature, that kind of stuff. And it will tell you time and time again, like the people that you select is absolutely crucial. I read it, I'm sure you've read it, but I didn't really feel it until I was making these decisions that, who's going to stay, who's going to join, who's going to get promoted. And then I started to realize, like, I can feel it in my bones now. Absolutely. This is a fundamental decision that we need to take. So I then started to think deeply about this topic as to how to maximize that.
Yeah, so I think I couldn't agree with you more that really, even on an individual level, individual recruitment decisions matter. It can be the difference between really enhancing, adding value, creating value, or really destroying. Taking away from. And I think that having the right sort of recruitment practices and getting the right people in some respects is the difference between winning and losing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like, somebody who's not super productive or as productive as other people, it's not like it's a neutral influence in all cases. In some cases, it can be a distinctly harmful influence to your organization. I was actually thinking about this the other day. It's especially important for team leads, like other people who are responsible for other people. Yeah. Those are the really crucial roles. I mean, all roles are crucial to get right. Exactly. But those are the ones I would look to first. And I was thinking, why? And I actually came to the conclusion that people managers, they're kind of like, in the people world, they're like leveraged investments. Because if you get it wrong, it's going to multiply across all their reports. But if you get it right, it's going to multiply across all these others. To me, I'm thinking about it as like a leveraged investment. You really need to place those bets carefully. And actually, I've genuinely found, if there's a part of the business that's failing, there's a person behind that. And if there's a part of the business that's succeeding, there's a person behind that. And the answer I've come to try and fix certain parts of the business is not, hey, let me figure out exactly what the problem is and fix it myself. You've not got the time. I've not got the time. It'll suck all your time.
Get the right person.
Exactly. Get the right person in. Then let them figure out what the problem is and fix it.
Absolutely. So we've landed on the fact that individuals within the organization matter, therefore recruitment matters.
Oh.
Right? But we're still confronted with the challenge that
like how?
how do we go about doing it? We have, I've personally experienced instances where we've put out adverts to recruit for positions, and easily up to 1,000 candidates may apply. Right? So you've only got X amount of time within which you can dedicate to make this decision. Right? You've got to screen. So firstly, you've got to make sure that the candidate pool that you have most matches the requirements that you have, and so therefore, where you put out your particular advert needs to match. The profiles needs to be well articulated, because you need to actually secure the right type of applicants into your process. You need to screen firstly, and you may have very limited control over initial screening processes. Then you need to interview, then you need to shortlist, and ultimately you need to select. Right? So how do you make sure that all of these different components really work together to get the result that you're looking for, which is an individual that can add value to your organization?
Look, I think I work for a large organization, and I think in those large organizations it's quite easy for the quality of the final decision to be maybe a little bit compromised because of a sort of a decision by committee. So where I'm getting to at this point is that I think there needs to be crystal clarity on firstly what you're looking for. What is going to drive productivity in this particular role? And that takes time, right? We need to sit and think about that. We need to have clarity of mind around that. I think those who are analytically minded, like myself, they can also get a bit too deep into the weeds on this particular topic. So, I was aware that quality of my decisions was not that great in terms of hiring, and I was aware of, the fact that, I need to look for these kinds of dimensions. And then I was thinking, then how do I weight these different dimensions? I can't run an experiment of my own. I don't have the resources. Nobody could do that. And that just, my whole interest in this, in trying to find a method that was improved, kind of ground to a halt. But the literature on cognitive science actually indicates that provided you just create some sort of structure and you apply that consistently and it's fairly logical, the quality of your decisions on average is going to be improved by this. So I think the first port of call is to have crystal clarity on what's going to contribute to success in that role. And if you give yourself a little bit of time, I think anybody could more or less come up with several dimensions that we think are crucial to look out for. Then
before you go any further, so the point here is that you actually need to think through what you're looking at. Right? So not just to run out and look for anybody that matches a broad profile of what you're looking for, but to have actually some process that is defined, that is thought through, that seeks to address business needs with particular outcomes, and that actually has to happen before you go out and recruit, because once you have that process, then even if that process is not perfect, over time that process can be refined. Right? And so introducing structure and process into your recruitment setting is probably the most fundamental thing that needs to be addressed.
I mean, process, developing it up front, being clear on what you're looking for. It's kind of like if you're running a research project, unless you do that up front, unless you think through what data do I want to collect, what data is meaningful.
Exactly.
And how do I want to collect that data that I think is meaningful? And then how do I agree I'm going to be evaluating that data? And how am I ultimately going to reach a decision based on that data? So what typically happens if it's not structured is it's just a total mess. So you have different hiring managers asking different sets of questions. You might even have the same hiring manager hiring for the same role asking different candidates, different questions. And that means that the data set that we've got on these candidates is completely random. It's just like based on a conversation. How do you compare? It's a really difficult operation to do. And this goes back to cognitive science. It's a lot easier for us to rank incorrectly. It's a lot more difficult for us to score or categorize. We can do ranking a lot easier, I should say, than other types of operations. But ranking operations require the same data. You have to have the same fields of information you've collected on these people to enable us with a ranking operation. So yeah, I think definitely structure it up front. I've worked for companies where it's been left up to the discretion of the hiring manager, and I think in those sorts of circumstances, it's just random chance almost who you hire. Like I was hiring people based on the degree to which I found them charming. I mean, that wasn't what I was telling myself or telling my bosses while we were hiring them. That's ultimately what I found out. So that's what I found where we don't have any structure. It's just, random chance. And then the quality of the people you're onboarding will be on average no different than the quality of the people in the general population. So you're not developing a set of staff that's going to be outcompeting the wider market, I don't think. So yeah, definitely preparing in advance is absolutely crucial.
But still, nonetheless, you're still presented with a situation whereby there is potentially a significant number of individuals that comes in, even though you may have a defined process. Are there any ways, especially now if you think about advancements in technology and potentially artificial intelligence and those sorts of elements, are there any ways in which you can still maintain the outcomes that you're looking for while at the same time being as efficient as possible, leveraging technology and so on and so forth, but appreciating and understanding that actually time also is often of critical importance. So how do you balance the two, and what mechanisms do you think are at our disposal to expedite in this instance?
So I think we're in a really interesting space because we've now got things coming from technology like generative AI and stuff like that, cloud computing. We've got decades of experience on building intuitive user interfaces that can lighten the burden on users. So I think on the technology side, there are actually a lot of things that could drastically reduce the time and effort required on the part of hiring managers. Because you're touching on, I think, a really crucial point, which is if we aren't building a structured process to our hiring, that's going to come with a lot more work. It's going to come with a lot more work, and already hiring is it's crucially important, everybody gets that, but it's never as urgent as that client who's calling you or that colleague who's flagging a risk in the business. It's never as urgent as that because hiring necessarily is going to take a few months. That person has to resign, month, etc. So it's necessarily going to take a lot of time. And what that means is that it's always at the bottom of the to-do list that's massive, right? Everybody's got a very big to-do list. So it comes on top of business as usual. It's always deprioritized. And what that means is that hiring managers are incentivized to decrease the amount of time they spend on this. So if your process comes in and it's yeah, great, we've thought it through, we've utilized the benefits coming from cognitive science to structure a protocol around this, improve the quality of our decisions, it's useless if nobody's complying with it. And if it's adding more work to somebody who's already got too much on their agenda, the risk of non-compliance is extremely high. So you might have designed this program, but it's not being executed. And that's effectively the same thing as having no process at all. And that's where I think technology can come in, because we can utilize the technology to, we've got this protocol that's improving, if we apply it, improving the quality of our decisions. Technology can actually, I don't think it's being leveraged right now, but it can decrease the amount of time and effort required on the hiring managers to ultimately follow that protocol that you've designed. So I think it's the marriage between cognitive science and then technology, some ones that I've listed out already, could allow us to, at the same time as improving the quality of those decisions, decrease the amount of time, which is like the sort of textbook meaning of disruption, because you can improve quality, but you can also decrease time, for example.
So just to, recap with some of the points that have been made. Firstly, we agree that hiring is critical. Hiring can potentially be transformative. For us to hire well, we need to approach it in a structured manner, having thought through the implications of it, and really embed that through a process to ensure repeatability. Because it is only from repeatability that you can derive meaningful comparison. And so process, repeatability, and where we can possibly leverage that technology to ensure that compliance is adhered to, because the last thing you want is a process that is not compliant, because then it goes back to problems that we identified, to get to a position whereby you're starting to realize positive outcomes. But you can only realize positive outcomes after a period of time. You recruit an individual, it's only, potentially after a year, 6 months or 3 months that either they've started, being productive to deliver and create the value that we're looking for. And it is only then after those processes have undergone that you can actually test whether the criterion that you put down in the first place is the correct criterion. So when you then look at closing the loop of recruit, and then you only really want to retain those who are actually need to be retained or are worthy of being retained, what are some of the considerations that would need to go into, especially where there may be variability in productivity, variability in outcomes, and how do you manage that feedback loop to ensure that initial decision, the protocols for making those decisions are as relevant as you understand it to be?
This is a really difficult one, I think, because, even within the field of selection, I don't think many organizations have really figured it out. Right? They haven't done that marriage of cognitive science and technology to improve quality of decisions and decrease the amount of effort and time involved. The next stage would be then to link those decisions to performance management, right? Which is who's retained, who's promoted by the business, to ensure that the corpus of the staff is just constantly getting better. I don't think that whole linkage has been done. I think some companies have tried, like Google has, I think, tried to measure productivity, beyond the point at which that person was given a certain score within the whole selection process. When they did that, by the way, they were seeing that there was very limited relationship, and I think that led them down the path of trying to improve the quality of their decisions. So I don't think that thing has actually been done, but I think there is a definite potential there, right? Linking your selection decisions to ultimately performance management. One thing to consider with that is it's not just about the candidate, it's also about the people who are part of that panel. And how can they get feedback on their decisions? Not just can we identify whether this person is somebody we should retain, somebody we should promote, and what does that tie back to in terms of what we predicted for their productivity as part of the selection process. So I envisage that linkage between the selection software to the performance management software, but it also has a dimension of what's that panel of evaluators and how can the technology feedback to them as decision makers in that whole process. How can we improve the quality of their decisions in that whole hiring process? If we do create that linkage, I think that could be really powerful.
Have we seen in the hiring space uptake of really radically new technologies that can streamline processes, enhance decisions? What's the lay of the land really? And has the hiring space really potentially kept up with the rest of the world or some of the more, let's call it, more sophisticated users of technology, when you think about the business, where it may be from process automation, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
How much of the hiring space has really seen real disruption in technology?
So, I mean, my exposure to the applications is not extremely wide. It's fairly limited. I think there's a whole range of different sort of platforms that exist, and there's different criteria for why, like, a really large business might select a certain vendor over another. It could be about support, it could be about the data protection, it could be about scope and just that confidence that this is a going concern for the long term. So there are other considerations that would factor into that, but I think there is still a lot of potential, because I think there's still this view from vendors to think that if it's a business application, it doesn't necessarily have to have a good UI or be fun to use or something. I don't understand why, right? These applications, we're talking about compliance. Compliance is an issue. If we design a process and the process, if it's followed, will result in a better outcome, we need to make sure that we comply with it, our staff complies with it. They're humans after all. And what I often find with a lot of process improvements internal to organizations is the instruction manual is like, it takes 100 times more time to read the instruction manual than to perform the primary task that's covered by that instruction manual. So there is a big gap in, I think, really good executions of what I would call intuitive UI, user interface that you can automatically not have to read that 100-page instruction manual and figure out on the fly and actually kind of want to use it more and more, as opposed to what we typically find in the business space, which is really dull, boring, slow, confusing interfaces that don't really bring a lot of satisfaction and pleasure through that process. Don't give you the prompts sort of as you go through that, but there's nothing stopping them from doing that, I think. So I think there is a big opportunity in that particular space.
Because the irony of it all is that you often don't. Recruitment is often as critical as it is often an afterthought, right? Even when it comes to these systems, right, with technology, you would develop systems around performance management or ERP systems or general applications that deal with individuals who are present within the organization, right? And so typically recruitment is bolted on as let's call it a functionality within a tool that has been developed to serve an alternative purpose, right? And so to your point, nobody really likes to do recruitment, right? Recruitment is often done begrudgingly to go through all of the processes and compliances and so on and so forth, yet the impact of a poor recruitment decision is actually a fundamental impact
a big issue
in relation to that. So we do have to overcome that dichotomy that is, how do we potentially develop technologies or utilize technologies that actually are fit for purpose and that are relevant to actually the hiring needs of an organization, while at the same time making it all user-friendly and intuitive and relevant. But I think we've gone from let's call it the decision, which is influenced by biases and how we structure it and so on and so forth, right through to how can we better execute on the overarching sort of process that drives that decision and the role that technology ultimately plays in that. Zach, to end off this discussion, I mean, are there any concluding points that you may have? Just in general, in terms of what's worked, what hasn't worked. What's your views on the future of recruitment in relationships?
Yeah, sure. So I might end off on just a few, because I was confronted with this scenario where I knew my decisions around hiring were not good. And I looked to, where you might typically look within the organization for guidance, like what's our process, what's our protocol. And when I found that not really forthcoming, I basically rolled my sleeves up and read the literature, and I think got to a place where I was like, actually, I think I can design something that can help me make better decisions. So in going into the literature, I think, and then executing my own, let's call it, hiring protocol, I think there was a few things that I picked out from that. And having applied that now in quite a few rounds, maybe there's a few things that I can share with you. So one of those is, like we've been talking about, design a structured process up front. And that's around what data am I going to collect, what's relevant, how am I going to collect it, and how am I going to evaluate that data. And another thing to consider is to specifically try and identify people who are gaming your process. The reason I'm suggesting that is there's a lot of very clever people out there who might be extremely disruptive to your business, who can fly through these sorts of protocols. So I would consciously design a specific module to try and identify these sorts of people. Like, psychopaths are very charming, and they can game these sorts of things. So we can design this protocol, but really I would encourage that as well.
So protocol to spot the psychopaths.
Exactly. Well, spot people who are gaming your system, because cognitive science has a whole battery of various tests that we can use to improve the quality of our decisions. But a lot of them are very gameable.
Yeah.
A lot of people know what I need to answer to basically pass the test. And on this topic of tests, I'd also strongly suggest that the research is very clear. Humans make poor decisions because of biases, because of noise, etc. Algorithms don't. Algorithms make reliable decisions on an ongoing basis. So wherever possible, if I figured out what I want to, what's important for this role, wherever possible, see which of these things I need to evaluate, I can get an algorithm to figure out for me and completely eliminate the human from that. A key example would, of course, be, I know it's got a bad press, but like things like IQ, just generalized intelligence. IQ is predictive of a lot of positive outcomes in later life. It should not be ignored just because it makes us feel a little bit uncomfortable. I know it makes us feel uncomfortable. I think it makes us feel uncomfortable because we don't want to be judged. But just bear in mind, whilst IQ is predictive, the majority of life outcomes is unpredictable. It's completely unpredictable. But within the set of tools we have, it's actually a very good tool. So I wouldn't discount that. Because actually, if we discount that, we're kind of using other proxies for IQ, like where have you studied? What degree did you study? And, if that's a proxy for IQ, that's a very expensive proxy for IQ, right? IQ test will take you about an hour to do. It'll cost you a few thousand rand. University education will take you 3 years and a few 100,000 rand maybe. Use tests wherever possible, I think. Use them judiciously. Balance them out against other things that you're going to have to collect yourself. And where you're collecting that information yourself within the context of an interview, always have more than one person doing that evaluation. At least more than one. Maybe 3 would also be better. I know that's a time sink. But what the benefit of having more than one person is the literature is very clear. The quality of our decisions is improved as a function of the size of the group. It's kind of shocking, provided that group do not confer with each other. So there's wisdom in crowds as long as the crowd don't speak to one another. And this is really dangerous with Teams and instant messaging. I see it happening the whole time. We're in an interview and they message me, this is great, this person. Don't do that. So create the rules and say, guys, no talking. Because that is the path to bias. So have multiple people doing the evaluation. Don't allow them to talk. Don't allow them to talk. Do the evaluations in isolation. And only once you've measured everything you think is important about this person, then you can regroup and look at your respective viewpoints on this person. So that's another thing I would strongly encourage us to do. And then the final decision, I would always recommend to be like a consensus from the panel. And the reason for that is false positives in hiring are really what you want to avoid. It's more important than a sense of fairness. I'm sorry to say. False positives are really like a false positive would be like, yes, let's hire this person, and it's a total disaster. That's what you really want to avoid as a function of that. So I would encourage you to make that final decision, not algorithmically determined, but like a consensual decision amongst all those people with the benefit of the data that you have collected as a function of that whole process.
I'm going to challenge you on one point here. So what you're speaking about does seem to be quite time consuming.
Oh yeah.
Right? So there's tests, there's stages. Typically, so how many stages do you think needs to be in a typical recruitment process? Granted, the more important or the more senior or the more strategic, if you can call it that, the position, we may want to allocate more time, but that there may be, other, let's call it, more generic positions that we may not necessarily have the time capacity to actually have extensive processes in relation to.
Yeah, so I mean, and all of this sounds great, right? But you're absolutely right. It takes a heck of a lot of time. But on the topic of time, I think actually if you have designed the process up front, a lot of the work is already done for you. For example, in the process that I designed, I was looking across 4 different units. And one of those units was around skills, knowledge, and experience. And I thought the best way of collecting this information was in the context of an interview. And then I was thinking about, okay, well, what are the dimensions of this person's skills, knowledge, and experience that I think is going to contribute to success in this role? Tried to whittle it down to about 6 or 7 different dimensions. And then I converted those into specific questions I asked to a candidate, structured as a competency-based question. It's a very specific kind of structure where we're asking about what that person's done in fact, as opposed to a hypothetical. The reason for that is psychopaths will, fly through the hypothetical, but maybe with talking about what they've done in the past, and then you probe a couple of levels, they might struggle to surface some credible details.
So psychopaths do really seem to trouble you, Zach?
They do, because, actually some studies, I don't know how valid these studies are, but they have suggested that in the upper echelons of business, there's a higher propensity of psychopaths than in the general population.
Absolutely.
And I can understand why. So they do fly through these sorts of systems. So yeah, we have to be very mindful of this. Anyway, so it's competency-based questions. The point I'm making is I've got like a total script that I'm repeating on an ongoing basis. I don't have to figure out just before that interview, oh, crumbs, what am I going to ask this person? Or in the moment, having to think about what I'm going to ask this person. I've already got the questions I'm going to ask, and this avoids the additional work I would need to do further down the line, right? And it also allows me to focus in that moment on what they're telling me, as opposed to thinking about what I'm going to say next. We're typically thinking about what we're going to say next, and not really listening to what that other person is telling us. I'm really going deep on what that person is telling us. And by us agreeing what we're going to be collecting up front and scripting it, that is true for all of those interviews in that functional domain for that kind of role, and you can roll that out globally. So imagine a scenario where we've got like a global organization, every single hiring manager is having to figure out their own kind of script in some way for every single interview, every single time. That's a huge amount of work. So by pre-planning the whole thing and making it, specifying the whole thing, you could actually save yourself quite a lot of time further down the path. So that's one point to make. The other point to make is that if we allow the algorithms to take over, like with tests, that can be fully automated.
Yeah.
That can be fully driven out of the cloud. You don't have to administer that. You don't have to score that. You just get the results back. So, and that's a really profound piece of information that you've collected on that person. You had no, requirement of your own time to get involved in. But yeah, it's going to take a heck of a lot of time. And that's, I think, one of the added reasons why we need to be very considerate about those people that we ultimately take a decision on. We need to be very, very confident before we take those decisions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time, Zach. I think this has been an extraordinary discussion from my side at the very least. I think there's been some very practical pieces of both lived and theoretical advice based on literature that is quite extensive, but also, going through the real highs and lows of hiring potentially well, but also hiring.
I can tell you.
Exactly. And I think to take out from this that structure does matter, process matters. If we can structure the process that enables us to drive towards better decisions that can lead better outcomes, the effect on that is greater value creation by virtue of us actually having a more relevant, competent, and fit for purpose staff. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.